Have you ever walked up to your own front door, only to realize it no longer belongs to you? My name is Madeline Turner. Most people call me Maddie. I'm an interior designer, a daughter of the South, and until recently, a wife. My husband Aaron died just 3 weeks ago. It was sudden, cruel, and impossible to make sense of. I left the hospital that morning with a crumpled death certificate and a wilted bouquet his coworkers had dropped off. But nothing prepared me for what I found waiting when I got home. The key didn't work, not my spare, not the one I'd used every day for 5 years. I tried again, hands shaking. Nothing. At first I thought maybe the lock had jammed. Maybe the door had swollen from the rain. Maybe I told myself this was just some terrible mistake. But as I looked through the window, I saw it. My curtains gone, my reading chair moved, and sipping tea in my living room like she owned the air itself was my mother-in-law, Evelyn Turner, dressed in navy cashmere, a teacup from my wedding china in her hand. Across from her was Sloane, Aaron's sister, folding blankets into a basket like they'd just returned from a shopping trip. There were boxes, lots of them. Everything was different. Everything was wrong. I knocked. Once, twice, then harder. Evelyn opened the door with a smile that looked carved from frost. "Madeline," she said as if nothing had happened. "Didn't expect you so soon." I could barely breathe. "Why doesn't my key work?" She tilted her head. "Because, dear, you don't live here anymore." And just like that, the world shifted. I wish I could say I fought back right then. I wish I had screamed, pushed through the door, made them leave. But in that moment, I froze. Because what do you say when your grief hasn't even had time to settle, and someone's already rewriting your life without you? This story is not just about property or paperwork. It's about silence. About the weight of all the things we do to keep love alive, and what happens when those things are erased. It's about the quiet war many women fight. After the funeral is over, after the casseroles stop coming, when the door shuts, and you're suddenly invisible. But it's also about strength, a different kind of strength. Because what Evelyn didn't know was this: the house she thought was hers was never truly unguarded. I still remember the way the wind felt that morning, sharp, unkind, and so unlike the Charleston air I had always known. January usually wraps our coastal town in something gentler. But that day, the cold sliced through my coat like it had a purpose. I hadn't changed clothes in 2 days. My jeans were wrinkled, the hem damp from hospital floors, and the overnight bag I had packed in panic still sat untouched in the front seat. I pulled into the driveway of the house Aaron and I had shared for 5 years, our little white frame dream with blue shutters and a swing we never quite got around to replacing. The roses out front had long withered, but they still stood dry and defiant. I was supposed to come home and grieve, not defend my place in it. But as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. The welcome mat was gone. In its place was a floral rug I had never seen before. It was small, but it was the first sign. The second was when my key wouldn't turn. I tried again once, twice, 3 times. My hands were trembling now, the numbness of exhaustion giving way to rising dread. Maybe the lock was frozen. I bent to get the spare from under the porch stone. It had lived there for years. That one didn't work either. I crouched there, stunned, as the realization crept in. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I stood, heart pounding, and looked through the front window. The linen curtains I had sewn myself, long ivory panels with pale yellow trim, were gone, replaced by stiff burgundy drapes that didn't let light in. Inside boxes were stacked near the couch. A velvet pillow sat on the chair where Aaron used to read. On the dining table, my grandmother's china teacups. But it wasn't me using them. It was Evelyn, Aaron's mother, sipping tea like she belonged there. Next to her, folding blankets, as if preparing a guest room, was Sloane, his sister. I knocked hard. My knuckles ached from the cold. Evelyn opened the door with a polite smile and said the words, "I'll never forget, Madeline dear. You don't live here anymore." It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. As if it had always been this way, as if I were the intruder. "This is my home," I managed to say, voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. But Evelyn didn't flinch. "Aaron paid for this house," she replied. "And with no will, no children, and no prenup. It defaults back to family, blood family." I could barely stand. Just days ago, I had been picking up his dry cleaning. Now I was being told I had no claim to the life I helped build. Sloan added almost like a joke. You left the side door unlocked when you rushed to the ER. We figured you wouldn't mind. That kind of cruelty doesn't come from grief, it comes from entitlement. And suddenly, something inside me hardened. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just turned and walked back to my car, heart racing, jaw set. Because I remembered something they didn't know. 2 years ago, when Aaron's company collapsed, I had refinanced the house in secret quietly, in my name. I used money I'd saved since my early 20s from design gigs and late nights freelancing. I hadn't done it for credit. I had done it for love, but now that silent choice was the only thing I had left to stand on. In that moment, I learned something that has shaped every step since grief does not come with guarantees. People often assume that loss brings people together, that families rally for give support. Sometimes, though, it does the opposite. It reveals the cracks already there. Evelyn never liked Charleston. She said it was too slow, too sweet, too soft for Aaron. And me, she thought I was wasting his potential. I used to swallow her words to keep the peace, to protect Aaron from the tension. But standing on that porch locked out of my own life, I realized silence had its price. The lesson: don't confuse sacrifice with invisibility. Just because you give everything doesn't mean they'll see you. And just because you kept the home running doesn't mean they'll let you stay. But here's what they didn't realize: I hadn't stayed quiet because I was weak. I had stayed quiet because I was focused. Because I believed in building, not breaking. And now I wasn't going to break either. I just needed to find the proof. I just needed to remind myself I didn't survive this long to give up now. They thought I had no claim. They didn't know I had a folder. They didn't know Aaron left more behind than a name. And that story, the one I'd nearly forgotten, is where everything begins again. It's strange how quickly a life can disappear when no one's there to guard the borders. The day after I was shut out, I sat in my car 2 blocks away from the house, watching the chimney puff smoke like nothing had changed. But everything had. Inside those walls, every trace of me was being wiped clean, like I had never laughed in that kitchen. Never hung photos in the hallway. Never cried on the floor the day Aaron got his diagnosis. Evelyn didn't just change the curtains. She took down the framed photo from our wedding, the sketch I did of our honeymoon cottage in Asheville, even the silly little ceramic bird I used to keep on the windowsill. Gone. Replaced by porcelain figurines and velvet throws, and the kind of cold perfection that only someone like her could call comforting. It was as if she had pressed a reset button on our lives, returning everything to before I existed. But I wasn't surprised, not really. If I was honest with myself, I'd known from the beginning that Evelyn had never seen me as family. She tolerated me, yes, but only in the way people tolerate weather they can't control. From day one, I was the girl from the soft South, the design major who wore thrifted blouses and baked birthday cakes from scratch. Aaron was meant for more, she once said under her breath at Thanksgiving, while I was carrying the cranberry sauce to the table. And Sloan, she had always followed her mother's lead. Their world was sharp-edged corporate, polished in a way mine never tried to be. I was warmth. They were glass. And Aaron, he'd been the bridge, the connector. Until now. His death didn't just leave a hole, it broke the only thing holding 2 very different worlds together. And without him, they wasted no time building a version of reality where I didn't belong. Still, there's a kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself with shouting. It comes in waves, small ones at first, then rising fast. That week, the mail stopped arriving in my name. My email to Evelyn asking to retrieve personal items went unanswered. The mortgage company forwarded a message: all inquiries must go through Turner Family Counsel. Just like that, I was no longer Maddie, Aaron's wife. I was a legal question mark. And yet I kept remembering every unpaid hour I'd spent holding it all together. 2 years earlier, when Aaron's tech startup imploded overnight, Evelyn didn't fly down. She didn't send a check. It was me who quietly dipped into savings, picked up freelance contracts, and refinanced the house, my name on every form, my hand signing every document. I didn't ask for recognition. I did it because I loved him, because I believed in us. But love, real love, doesn't come with applause. It comes with spreadsheets at midnight. It comes with clipping coupons. It comes with enduring without expectation. And here's the lesson I hope someone hears today. If you've ever stood in the background of your own life, hoping that quiet effort would one day speak for itself, don't wait. Write it down. Save the receipts. Document your worth not because you need credit, but because someday you may need protection. We teach women to be gracious, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person, but no one teaches us how to preserve our legacy, how to say I mattered here when others are eager to forget. I hadn't planned for Aaron to leave so soon, but something in me, call it intuition, call it survival, had kept those documents tucked away. The refinance, the payments, the contracts, and something else, something I hadn't even remembered existed. That's what came next. In a small drawer in Aaron's old office, behind a stack of unused wire adapters and business cards, I found a folder. Thin, labeled in his handwriting, postnup. Do not discard. And when I opened it, my hands shaking, I realized Aaron had left me more than memories. He had left me a weapon of truth. That single folder changed everything. But could it really undo what they'd already claimed? Could it stand against a mother's anger and a sister's silence? I didn't know yet. But I knew this: it was time to stop surviving in silence and start fighting back. The night Aaron's startup fell apart, he couldn't sleep. He lay on the couch staring at the ceiling fan, as if it held the answers. I remember hearing the soft click of his keyboard at 3 a.m., then the sound of him turning the pages of an old business book I'd seen him read before college. That kind of quiet panic, the kind where a man questions his entire worth, isn't loud. It's the sound of someone unraveling from the inside. I made chamomile tea and sat on the floor beside him. "It's over," he whispered. I failed us, but he hadn't. Not to me. What I saw that night wasn't failure. It was exhaustion, heartbreak, and the pressure of carrying everything alone. And so while he slept the next morning, I dressed quietly, drove to the credit union, and did what I had to do. I refinanced the house. In my name. I didn't tell him. Not out of deceit, but out of love. Out of instinct. Out of the deep, almost invisible wisdom that women often carry without anyone noticing. That money had been saved over 10 years. Client by client, sketch by sketch. I'd squirreled it away during slow seasons, in the margins of holidays and the stolen hours between jobs. It wasn't supposed to go toward mortgage payments. It was meant for the dream studio I had always talked about. A space of my own, a someday kind of place. But in that moment, I traded my someday for our today. I picked up freelance gigs I hadn't touched in years. I designed kitchens I'd never cook in and living rooms I'd never sit in, all to keep the lights on at home. I paid bills, handled repairs, managed groceries like a game of Tetris, each dollar needing to stretch twice its length. I clipped coupons, tracked spreadsheets, and took client calls from the laundry room so Aaron wouldn't see the stress on my face. Because I didn't want to add to the weight he already carried. Because I believed we were a team, and when one partner falls, the other steps up. There's this narrative we're sold that love is grand gestures and sweeping sacrifices. But real love is hidden in the details. It's showing up every day when it's hard. It's choosing to protect someone's pride instead of pointing fingers. I wasn't trying to be noble. I was trying to survive. Trying to keep our roof above us without making him feel like less of a man. Because I knew Aaron, and I knew how much being the provider meant to him even after the business folded. Even when he cried into my shoulder and called himself a burden. He wasn't. He was someone who had stumbled, and all I wanted was to help him stand again. But here's what no one tells you: when you give in silence, you also risk being forgotten in silence. The receipts fade, the witnesses disappear, and unless you speak up, no one will ever know you were there holding everything together while pretending nothing was broken. That's the lesson I wish I had learned earlier. Document your contribution not for praise, but for protection. Keep the bank statements, save the emails, screenshot the nights you worked late. Because sometimes love stories are beautiful until someone else rewrites the ending. And if you're not holding the pen, you risk becoming a footnote in your own life. When I found that folder labeled postnup, I cried. Not because I felt powerful, but because I realized Aaron had seen me. Truly seen me. That simple agreement was more than legal paperwork. It was recognition. It was his way of saying, I know what you've done. I know what you've given. And if anything ever happens to me, I want you protected. The last page of the folder was a single sheet of lined paper written in Aaron's handwriting. Just 4 sentences. But they were enough to anchor me again. If you're reading this, something awful has happened. If Mom tries anything, show this to your lawyer. You know how she is. Keep this safe, Roch. Roch, that was his nickname for me, soft and silly, and somehow now it was a battle cry. I had the proof, I had the paper, but what I didn't know was how far Evelyn would go to keep me out. The quiet war was about to become something much louder. Charleston is a town where people still wave from porches, where neighbors remember your dog's name and church bulletins share more than prayer requests. I always believed that kind of closeness meant protection, that when life unraveled, someone would show up with a casserole or a porch light left on. But grief does strange things. It makes the world quieter, colder. And when grief is laced with scandal, when whispers about your in-laws taking your house float through small-town brunches, people look away. Not because they're cruel, but because they don't know what to say. Or worse, because they've already chosen a side. I reached out to the people I thought would be there. My neighbor Carla, who once borrowed sugar for weeks. My old college friend who lives across the bridge. Even Aaron's coworker who came to our wedding and cried harder than anyone during our first dance. All I got were short replies, long pauses, and polite confusion. I thought Evelyn was handling everything. I heard it was complicated. I didn't want to get in the middle. And just like that, I wasn't just grieving my husband, I was grieving the community I thought would catch me when I fell. The silence wasn't just outside, it was inside me too. I stayed in a motel off Highway 17, the kind with scratchy blankets, and a vending machine that only accepted quarters. Every morning, I stared at the same faded painting of a beach I'd never visit, wondering how everything had flipped so fast. I didn't cry, not in the way people expect. Instead, I folded my grief into tasks, emailing the funeral home, calling the credit union, writing lists I never finished. I kept checking my phone, hoping anyone would call and say, "This isn't right. I'm with you," but no one did. Sloane posted a photo of herself on Instagram in front of the house captioned, "Coming home to family." The comments were full of hearts and praying hands. No one asked where I was. No one noticed I was gone. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own life, you'll understand what that does to a person. It's not just sadness, it's erasure. Like you were never there at all. What hurt most wasn't that I'd been pushed out. It was how easily the world accepted it. There's an unspoken assumption that family dramas are private, messy things best left untouched. But what happens when your home becomes the battlefield and you're the only one unarmed? I started to realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. Before, I'd spent years assuming that if I loved deeply, gave generously, and stayed quiet, long enough people would see me. But love isn't always recognized. Generosity isn't always repaid. And silence. Silence can look a lot like absence. It can give others permission to rewrite the story without you. That's what Evelyn was doing. She wasn't just claiming space, she was claiming history, painting herself as the grieving mother stepping in to take care of her son's estate, while I was painted as the outsider, the one who didn't belong. I wish I could say I stood up immediately, that I marched to the front steps and demanded justice. But the truth is, when you've been gaslit long enough, even the truth starts to flicker. You start to question your own memories. Did I really do enough? Was I ever truly part of that family? It's a dangerous place to linger. And yet here's the lesson that rose slowly from the fog. People will not always validate your story, but that doesn't make it any less true. When no one else stands beside you, you learn how to stand for yourself. I remember waking up one morning with my neck stiff from the motel pillow, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of untouched coffee. I looked at the folder again, Aaron's note, the postnup, the proof of all I had done to keep our life intact. And I thought, this is my witness. I didn't need a crowd. I didn't need applause. I needed courage. I picked up the phone and called Natalie Kim, my old college roommate, now a real estate attorney in Atlanta. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I told her everything, she didn't ask if I had exaggerated. She didn't suggest I walk away. She simply said, "Email me everything. We're going to fix this." In that moment, I remembered what real support feels like, not loud, not performative, but steady. It was the first warm light I'd felt in weeks, and it was enough to pull me to my feet. Natalie gave me hope, but I knew hope alone wouldn't be enough. If I wanted my home, my voice, my name back. I had to fight. And the first battleground, Aaron's office. I waited until after midnight. The streetlights outside the house cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the neighborhood was silent in that way only old towns can be like. Even the air was holding its breath. I parked a block away far enough not to wake suspicion. The plan wasn't brave, it wasn't even legal, but it was necessary. There was one place Evelyn wouldn't have touched, and I was betting everything on that instinct. Erin's office, what she used to call the junk drawer of the house, tucked behind the guest bedroom with no windows and a door that always stuck slightly. It had become his cave of cables, notebooks, prototypes, and dreams. Evelyn hated the clutter, which meant she wouldn't go near it. The side entrance off the laundry room had a faulty latch. Aaron always said he'd fix it. He never did. I slipped in through that creaky old door like I had 100 times before, heart pounding in my ears. The lavender scent Evelyn filled the house with clung to the air, foreign and artificial. I moved fast. I couldn't afford hesitation. The office was exactly as he'd left it. The clutter, the smell of old coffee, the small lamp with the cracked ceramic base. I almost cried just seeing it untouched. It felt like Aaron had just stepped out for groceries. I ran my hands along the top drawer of his desk. Cables, receipts, USBs labeled in his handwriting. I opened a file box near the floor and flipped through folders, taxes contracts, a couple labeled pitch decks, and Q3 projections. Then I saw it, a black folder tucked between two outdated tech manuals. On it, written in thick familiar marker, postnup. Do not discard. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were 3 pages of legal print on letterhead I recognized. Dated 2 years after our anniversary. It outlined a postnuptial agreement, a legally binding document stating that in the event of Aaron's death, all jointly owned assets, including the house, would transfer to me. It was signed, notarized, and witnessed. And then at the back, folded like a note passed in class, was a single sheet of lined notebook paper in Aaron's slanted, unmistakable handwriting. If you're reading this, it began. Something awful has happened. If Mom tries anything, show this to your lawyer. You know how she is. Keep this safe, Raj. I ran my fingers over his nickname, for me, Raj. A nonsense word we made up years ago while talking in bed about silly things. That single page felt heavier than anything I'd ever held. It was more than proof. It was validation. It was protection. And it was love lingering on the page long after his voice had gone silent. I held it to my chest and sank to the floor, surrounded by the scent of his cologne and the ticking of the dusty desk clock. That was the first time I cried since the funeral. Not because I was broken, but because I finally felt seen. He had believed in me even if his family didn't. He had trusted me with his name, his future, and in the end, his legacy. Here's the lesson I carried out with that folder clutched to my coat. Never assume someone else will protect your worth for you. Aaron had the clarity to put it in writing. That's rare. But what about all the other women like me who don't get that chance? Who give and love and build only to find themselves erased from their own stories? I had something many don't, paper-proof. But even that wouldn't be enough without action. That night, I scanned every page at a late-night copy shop, emailed Natalie everything, and saved backups in 3 different drives. Because I knew what was coming next. Evelyn wasn't just going to step aside. People like her don't lose gracefully. They rewrite the story, they lawyer up, they double down. But now, for the first time in weeks, I had leverage. And more importantly, I had resolve. No more waiting, no more silence. The house may have smelled like someone else's perfume now, but it was still mine. Not just in documents, but in memories, in effort, in love. And I was ready to reclaim it, piece by piece, starting with the truth Aaron had left behind. Evelyn had her lawyer, but now I had mine. And the first move in our quiet war was about to be made. With proof in hand, I was no longer asking to be heard. I was demanding it. When I emailed Natalie the scanned copy of the postnup, I half expected her to say it wasn't enough, that something would be missing or contested or just not strong enough to stand up in court. But when she called me back, her voice held something I hadn't heard from anyone since Aaron died, certainty. Maddie, she said, this changes everything. We're not hoping anymore, we're acting. That one sentence was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. In just 24 hours, she had contacted a local probate attorney, pulled public records on the house, confirmed the property was refinanced under my name, and filed a formal notice of representation. I was no longer standing alone in the dark. I had counsel, I had a paper trail, I had the beginnings of a case, and most importantly, I had a voice again. One that wasn't filtered through grief or guilt, but one that knew exactly what it was fighting for. But of course, nothing about this would stay quiet for long. Less than 2 days after filing, I got a knock at the motel door. Evelyn stood there in a crisp black coat, lips pressed so tightly together they looked like they'd forgotten how to smile. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize. Gray suit, gold wedding band, leather folder in hand. "Rachel," she said, calling me by my legal name, like it was a formality. "This is Mr. Langley, our family's legal advisor. We're here to discuss next steps regarding the property." I didn't flinch. I zipped up my coat, stepped out into the brisk air, and met them in the parking lot. No more letting them control the space. "The house is mine," I said calmly. Mr. Langley blinked, startled by my tone. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "Aaron left no will," she said, as if that were the final word. But I didn't let her finish. I reached into my folder, pulled out a neatly clipped packet, and handed it over. Postnuptial agreement. Signed, notarized, legally binding. All joint assets passed to me upon Aaron's death, including the house. The silence that followed was the most satisfying quiet I'd heard in weeks. Mr. Langley flipped through the papers, his brow furrowed. Evelyn didn't even look at them. She just stared at me, like I'd betrayed her somehow. "You're bluffing," she said, finally, her voice thin and sharp. "If I'm bluffing," I replied, "then you have nothing to worry about. But if I'm not, you've been trespassing on private property." Mr. Langley subtly stepped backward, as if distance could protect him from the truth. I held my ground, not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer had the same grip on me. I had already lost so much. I wasn't about to surrender what remained. The moment they walked away, Evelyn red-faced, Mr. Langley silent, I felt something shift. Not just in them, but in me. I had always been the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who kept things smooth and polite. But this wasn't about being nice anymore. This was about being right. And for the first time, I wasn't asking for space. I was claiming it. Here's the truth. Most of us are taught that standing up for yourself has to be loud, dramatic, full of fury. But I've learned it can be quiet, steady, legal. It can be a folder handed over calmly in a parking lot. It can be a sentence that starts with "I have rights" and ends with "I'm not leaving." The legal system isn't perfect, but it respects documentation. It doesn't care if someone doesn't like you. It cares if you have a signature, if you've done the work. And that's what I had years of silent labor turned into black and white evidence. Natalie helped me file for an official injunction to stop Evelyn from occupying the home, while the probate process unfolded. We sent notices. We made our case. It wasn't revenge. It was recovery. And that's the small lesson I took with me into every meeting, every form, every conversation with lawyers and court clerks. Sometimes healing doesn't come from apologies or closure. Sometimes it comes from pushing forward with clarity, with facts, with boundaries that say, "You can't rewrite me out of my own life." I didn't want to win to spite them. I wanted to win because I had already paid the price in silence. The courtroom wasn't like the ones you see in movies. There were no dramatic gasps, no gavel slams, just soft murmurs, file folders, the faint hum of a ceiling fan. But beneath the surface, the tension pulsed like electricity. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Natalie, heart beating a little too fast, palms resting on a copy of the postnup. Evelyn sat across from us in a dark green blazer, lips pursed, hands folded over a silk scarf. Sloane was there too, all neutral makeup and blank expression. Their attorney, Mr. Langley, opened with a calm, rehearsed statement about family interests, grieving transitions, and disputed entitlements. They made it sound so clean. But I knew what it really was, erasure wrapped in courtesy. They claimed I had coerced Aaron into signing the postnup during a fragile mental period, that I had taken advantage of his distress, that I wasn't a wife, but a planner preying on his weakness. I felt my stomach twist, not because they were winning, but because they were lying, rewriting history in front of strangers. But Natalie didn't blink. She leaned in and said softly, "Stay calm. We have more truth than they have story." Then it was my turn to speak. I stood slowly, voice steady, even as my knees trembled. I talked about the refinance, about how I never asked for praise, how I just kept paying bills and fixing the things Aaron couldn't. I told the court how Aaron had written that note in his own handwriting in a moment of clarity, not confusion. And Natalie presented the paper trail copies of my bank statements, emails confirming Aaron's agreement, even the scanned postnup from the law office. But what made the difference wasn't just documentation, it was the truth in the details. Like the way I knew Aaron always used green ink for important notes, or that he hated legal jargon, which is why he had written his final request to me in plain language. The judge nodded slowly, listening with a furrowed brow and eyes that stayed fixed on the page. And then something I didn't expect. One of our former neighbors, Mr. Rowland, took the stand. He was in his 70s, a retired librarian who lived next door. Quiet man. We'd exchanged tomatoes and mail for years. He cleared his throat and said, "I remember seeing Maddie carry groceries, mow the lawn, fix that porch swing. Every week. I never saw Evelyn here unless it was Christmas." That moment changed everything. Because truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the voice of a neighbor, soft and simple, stating what he's seen with his own eyes. It was one thing for me to say I belonged. It was another thing for someone outside the story to confirm it. Mr. Rowland's testimony cracked something open. It made the courtroom feel less like a stage, and more like a mirror finally reflecting what had really happened. Natalie closed with a clear, quiet argument. This case is not about inheritance. It's about recognition, about honoring the legal, financial, and emotional reality of a marriage that Evelyn Turner chose not to see. There were no gasps, no final scene, just a pause. And then the judge said we'd receive the decision in writing. We walked out in silence, the air outside heavier than it had been before. But something had shifted, not just in court, but in me. I had stood in the room where people tried to rewrite my worth, and I told the truth anyway. That matters. Even if you don't win right away, telling your story matters. Here's the thing, most people never make it to that room. Not because they don't deserve to, but because they're exhausted. Because fighting for your truth while grieving feels impossible, and I get that. There were days I wanted to give up, to say, let them have it, just to make the noise stop. But I didn't. Because this wasn't just about a house. It was about every woman who's ever been told she was temporary, who poured herself into something permanent, only to be erased from it. It was about the quiet dignity of standing in your own name and refusing to shrink. That's the lesson I learned in that courtroom. You don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to stand, fully, honestly, even when your voice shakes, especially then. And as Natalie and I walked back to her car, she glanced over and said, "No matter what the judge writes, you won something today." And she was right, because even if the world never clapped for what I built, I had finally claimed it with my own voice. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, thick and official. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. The sound of rustling motel sheets behind me, the humming of the old AC unit steady in the background. I already knew what it said, but knowing and reading aren't the same thing. The court ruled in my favor. The postnup was upheld, the refinance confirmed, and Evelyn and Sloan were ordered to vacate the property within 14 days. Just like that, the house was legally mine again. But when I read the decision, there was no sense of triumph. No dramatic swell of relief. Instead, I felt something smaller, quieter, like the end of a very long exhale. That's the thing about winning when you've carried the weight alone for so long. Even justice feels like a soft landing, not a celebration. I folded the papers, neatly placed them back into the folder, and sat on the edge of the bed. I had won, but my husband was still gone. The house was still full of their things, and I was still waking up in a room that smelled like disinfectant and loneliness. Grief doesn't end when the gavel drops. Sometimes it just finds a quieter place to live. A week later, I returned to the house not as an intruder, but with a locksmith and a court officer. Evelyn and Sloan were gone. The lavender scent had faded, but the curtains were still heavy and wrong. There were crystal figurines on my kitchen shelves and a velvet pillow on the couch Aaron and I used to nap on Sunday afternoons. I walked slowly through the house, like I was inside a photograph someone else had taken. It didn't feel like home yet. It felt like a set that had been dressed to look like someone else's life. I spent the first afternoon in silence, just removing things, bagging up the pillows, boxing up the figurines, clearing away the noise. Not out of anger, but out of restoration. Every item I removed gave the walls back their voice. I scrubbed the baseboards, lit the lemon candle Aaron used to love, and sat in the living room with a cup of tea in my own mug. And for the first time in months, I felt the house exhale with me. Like it too had been waiting. People think victory looks like confetti, but sometimes it looks like peeling off a label from a cabinet, like rewashing dishes that were once yours, like sitting on the porch swing with a blanket and the quiet knowledge that you are still here, that despite everything you're still standing. That's what I learned in those first few weeks back in the house. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. I had to let go of the fantasy that winning would make the hurt disappear. It didn't. I still cried some nights. I still reached for Aaron's side of the bed. But I also smiled when I found one of his notes in a cookbook, and laughed when I opened the junk drawer to find his stash of mismatched batteries. Grief softened just a little with the return of the familiar. And over time, the house felt less like a battleground and more like a memory I was slowly reclaiming. Not just from Evelyn, but from the pain that had drowned it. Here's what I know now. Peace is something we choose over and over again. It's not given to us in courtrooms or folded into verdicts. It comes when we stop waiting for someone else to make it right and start building it for ourselves, brick by quiet brick. I didn't get to keep everything, not the man I loved, not the future we planned, but I got to keep the place where we built it. And that meant more than anyone on the outside could understand. A few days after I moved back in, a knock came at the door. It was Carla, the neighbor who hadn't replied to my text after the funeral. She brought banana bread. "I'm sorry," she said. I didn't know what to say, but I wanted you to know I'm glad you're back. I thanked her, because I knew then people don't always get it right, but sometimes they show up when it matters most, and that's something too. I stood in the doorway, warm plate in my hands, and looked out over the yard. The roses were blooming again, soft and unannounced, just like me. The house was mine again, but now I had to rebuild more than walls. I had to rebuild myself. And that journey, learning where grief ends and healing begins, was still unfolding. The legal battle wasn't over, but for the first time I wasn't afraid. The house might still be full of their things, but the truth now had a name, mine. The documents were filed, the notices were sent. But I knew Evelyn wouldn't disappear quietly. The courtroom was coming next, and with it the truth would finally have to speak louder than the gossip. The quiet that followed was a different kind of silence. Not the kind that made you feel erased or forgotten, but the kind that gave you space to breathe. I spent the first few weeks back in the house, reacquainting myself with stillness. No lawyers, no hearings, no closed doors, just me, the creak of old floorboards, and the slow, unfamiliar feeling of safety. But healing doesn't come just because the noise stops. Grief leaves an imprint, and so does betrayal. I started therapy finally, not because I felt broken, but because I needed language for the parts of myself I'd tucked away to survive. I needed to understand why I had shrunk myself for so long. Why I'd kept the peace even when it cost me pieces of who I was. My therapist asked a simple question during one session. When did you first learn that being quiet was the safest choice? It hit like a stone in a still lake. I sat with that question for days, because somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that silence was strength. But now I was learning that boundaries, that word we so often confuse with walls, are a different kind of strength altogether. A softer, braver one. One morning, I received a letter. Handwritten. From Sloane. It was short, a little messy, like she'd rewritten it 3 times before sealing the envelope. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't defend her actions. She just said, "I believed Mom. And I'm sorry. I should have asked you. I should have looked closer." I sat at the kitchen table holding that letter in one hand and a warm mug in the other. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't change the fact that she had stood by while I was locked out of my own life. But it was a thread, a fragile one, dangling between who we had been and who we might still become. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a door you throw open. It's a window you crack slowly when the air feels safe enough to let in. I didn't write her back. Not yet, but I placed the letter in the same drawer where Aaron's note lived. a quiet place for honest things. And that was enough for now. Because healing isn't linear, it spirals and folds and sometimes circles back to grief. But each time you meet it stronger. Little by little, I began to reclaim myself not just as a widow or a woman who won in court, but as Maddie, just Maddie. I reopened my design portfolio and began taking clients again, small projects at first. I turned the guest room into a home office and painted it the soft sage color Aaron once teased me about. "It's always green with you," he'd say, and he was right. But green has always felt like new beginnings. I joined a support group for women navigating loss and legal battles. People who knew the strange overlap between mourning and paperwork, between missing someone and having to fight for what they left behind. We shared stories, we passed tissues, and slowly I found comfort in being part of something again. That's the piece no one tells you about grief. It isolates you. Not because others mean to leave you, but because pain makes you speak a language not everyone understands. But when you find people who do, even the deepest ache feels a little less sharp. Even the heaviest days get easier to carry. And here's the lesson I want to leave with anyone listening. Your worth is not defined by what others acknowledge. It is not measured by titles, inheritance, or who stands beside you when things go wrong. It is measured by your breath on the coldest mornings, by the way you show up for yourself when no one else does, by how you protect your peace without needing permission. Reclaiming my life wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about proving Evelyn or Sloan wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was never the disposable one. That my love, my labor, my loyalty, they mattered even if no one applauded them at the time. And if you take nothing else from my story, take this. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to leave the door closed if the people on the other side didn't knock when you needed them most. Moving forward doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means peace. And peace I've found as a home I'm still learning how to decorate one quiet room at a time. One morning I stood in front of the fireplace, holding Aaron's letter. I knew exactly what to do with it. The final piece of this homecoming wasn't legal, it was personal. And it would change everything. It happened on a Tuesday. The sun was rising slow and golden, casting long stripes of light across the hardwood floors in the living room. I had just finished dusting the bookshelf. Something about that quiet task had always soothed me, and I noticed the frame I'd left sitting empty on the mantel. It was one I had picked up years ago at a flea market, thinking I'd use it for a photo of Aaron and me, but I never got around to it. That morning I walked to the drawer, pulled out his note, the one he'd left tucked in the folder with the postnup, and slid it gently behind the glass. His handwriting, still smudged a little at the edge where my thumb had held it too tightly, looked as steady as ever. "Keep this safe, Roch." That's all it said. And somehow that 4-line note held the weight of everything he left behind. Not just the house, not just the instructions, but the belief in me. The quiet truth that even in the face of everything falling apart, he had trusted me to hold the center. Framing that note wasn't just an act of memory, it was a declaration. That I was no longer asking to be included. No longer proving that I had earned my place. I had lived it. I had built it. I had kept it running in the dark, and I had brought it back into the light. The fireplace had always been the heart of our home, where we put stockings at Christmas, where Aaron once read a book aloud during a storm, where we sat on the floor with takeout containers when the dining table was too covered in clutter. Now it had a new centerpiece, not a portrait, not a quote, but a promise, a simple handwritten reminder that I mattered, that I was not a placeholder in someone else's story. I was the writer of my own. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that truth sink in. Not as something I had to fight for, but as something I finally believed. A few weeks later, I hosted a dinner. Nothing fancy. Just a few neighbors, some women from the support group, and Madeline, who flew in from Atlanta and showed up with a bottle of wine, and that same fierce smile I'd first seen across a dorm room 15 years ago. We ate on mismatched plates, told stories that made us laugh until our eyes watered, and for a moment the house felt full. Not with tension or grief, but with warmth, with life. And when someone asked about the note over the fireplace, I told them the story. Not all the legal details, not the courtroom moments, or the icy silence from Evelyn. Just the part where a man loved his wife enough to make sure she'd be okay, and where that woman finally chose to believe she was. After dessert, Natalie pulled me aside and said, "You should tell this story. Really tell it. Not just to us, but to others. Because there are so many women who need to hear that they're not crazy, not invisible, not alone." And she was right. Because for every Maddie, there are 1,000 others who kept the lights on, made the appointments, picked up the pieces without recognition, without thanks, and without a safety net. Women who are told they're being dramatic when they speak up, or difficult when they set boundaries. But we are not difficult. We are necessary. And if my story helps even one woman look at herself differently, to stop apologizing, to stop shrinking, to hold her own name with pride, then every sleepless night, every painful step of that journey was worth it. Because at the end of it all, it wasn't just about keeping a house. It was about finding a home in myself. And that more than any verdict or legal victory was the true ending I didn't even know I needed. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt erased, underestimated, or like your quiet efforts didn't count, please take a moment to share this video. You never know who might need to hear it today. Leave a comment below if you've walked a similar path, or if you're still in the middle of yours. And remember, you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to tell the truth. You are not invisible. You are not replaceable. And you were never meant to be quiet forever. Thank you for being here. You're stronger than you know.